A humble black chef stood quietly, his focus entirely on the wedding feast he was preparing. His plain white apron, crisp but simple, made him look like just another kitchen hand, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. The air around him was a symphony of culinary magic, but he was the invisible conductor. Suddenly the bride stormed in, a whirlwind of white lace and fury. She wrinkled her nose, a mask of theatrical disgust twisting her features. She screamed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the joyous buzz of the reception. "This food smells like trash!" She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at him, her laughter a cruel, sharp sound that echoed in the suddenly silent kitchen. But what nobody in that room knew, what this bride could not possibly comprehend, was that the man she had just insulted wasn't just a chef. He was Marcus Reed, a millionaire owner of a global empire of Michelin-starred restaurants. By the end of this night, jaws would drop, reputations would shatter, and the world, or at least this small, glittering part of it, would know exactly who the real boss was. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story already has you hooked, don't forget to smash that like button. The grand ballroom of the estate was a picture of perfection. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables draped in white linen, each setting a miniature masterpiece of polished silver and sparkling glass. The air hummed with the gentle clinking of champagne flutes and the low, happy murmur of 200 guests dressed in their finest. Laughter bubbled up from different corners of the room, light and carefree, weaving through the melodies played by a string quartet tucked away in a corner. The scent that filled the air was divine, a complex and intoxicating perfume of roasted duck glazed with honey and lavender, of wild mushroom risotto earthy with truffle oil, of fresh bread still warm from the oven. It was a scent that promised a feast of a lifetime, a culinary experience that whispered of luxury and artistry. For a moment it was a perfect wedding reception, a flawless celebration of love and new beginnings. Then the bride, Amber Collins, shattered the illusion. She wasn't in the ballroom anymore. She had stormed away from the head table, her face a thundercloud, and marched straight towards the large, swinging doors of the kitchen. Her new husband, Daniel, had tried to stop her, a look of confusion and concern on his face, but she had brushed his hand away. "I just want to make sure everything is perfect," she had hissed, a smile plastered on her face for the guests who might be watching. But her eyes held a cold fire. She burst through the kitchen doors like a conquering general entering a surrendered city. The calm, professional hum of the kitchen staff came to an abrupt halt. Slicing stopped. Sautéing ceased. Every head turned towards her. The contrast between her pristine $1,000 gown and the functional steel and tile kitchen was stark. She stood there, her hands on her hips, her expression one of utter disdain. She took a theatrical sniff of the air, the very same air that the guests were sighing over in delight. Her nose wrinkled, her upper lip curled. "What is that smell?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. The head waiter, a man with 20 years of experience, froze mid-step. The sous chefs exchanged nervous glances. From his station at the main stove, Marcus Reed, the man in charge, didn't even look up. He was carefully plating a delicate arrangement of seared scallops, his hands steady, his focus absolute. This only seemed to enrage Amber further. Her eyes locked onto him, onto his simple white apron and the quiet dignity of his work. He was the source, the creator of this offensive odor. "This food smells like trash!" she shrieked. The words exploded into the tense air. Every person in the kitchen flinched as if struck. The waitstaff turned pale, their professional smiles vanishing, replaced by masks of pure shock. One young waitress dropped a stack of clean napkins, the soft thud sounding like a gunshot in the frozen room. They had heard demanding clients before, picky brides, entitled grooms, but this was different. This was pure, unadulterated venom. Amber pointed directly at Marcus. "Did some janitor cook this? Is this a joke?" Her voice dripped with scorn. She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his plain apron. It was clean. It was practical. but to her, it was a symbol of his lowly status. "Look at you," she scoffed, a cruel laugh escaping her lips. "You're just a cook. I paid for a world-class experience, not something whipped up by the help." The humiliation was a physical thing, a thick, suffocating blanket that fell over the kitchen staff. They were all the help. They all felt the sting of her words. Marcus finally finished his task. He placed the last microgreen on the scallop with the precision of a surgeon. Only then did he straighten up and turn to face her. His face was a calm, unreadable mask. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, no shame. He simply wiped his hands on a clean towel tucked into his apron string. He offered no defense, no explanation, no apology. His silence seemed to infuriate her even more. It was as if he was immune to her attack, and that was an insult she could not bear. Just as she opened her mouth to unleash another tirade, the kitchen doors swung open again. Daniel, the groom, stood there. His face, which had been alight with happiness just minutes before, was now a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. He took in the scene in an instant. His bride, beautiful and terrible, pointing a shaking finger at a silent chef. The entire kitchen staff frozen in a state of suspended animation, their faces a mixture of fear and outrage. The tension in the room was so thick he could taste it. He saw the way Amber was looking at the chef, the man he had personally entrusted with the most important meal of his life. And in that moment, Daniel felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The perfect day was beginning to crack, and he had a terrible feeling that he was watching his new wife hold the hammer. Marcus remained completely still, his composure an unshakable fortress against Amber's onslaught. He met her furious gaze with a look that was neither defiant nor submissive. It was simply calm. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of politeness so subtle it could have been missed. "Dinner will be served shortly, ma'am," he said, his voice even and low, carrying a quiet authority that seemed to momentarily startle her. It was the voice of a man in total control, not the stammering apology of a scolded servant. Amber's shock lasted only a second. Then her face twisted into a smirk. She saw his calm not as strength, but as weakness. He was a coward, hiding behind a polite facade because he knew he was out of his depth. He was just a cook, and she was the queen of this day. Her victory felt complete. She needed to punctuate it, to make sure everyone in this kitchen understood the new hierarchy. Her eyes darted around and landed on a silver tray held by a petrified young waiter. It was laden with exquisite hors d'oeuvres, tiny perfect bites of prosciutto-wrapped melon and sun-dried tomato tapenade on toasted brioche. With a swift, vicious movement, she reached out and slapped the tray. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of contempt. The heavy silver platter clattered to the polished tile floor. The delicate appetizers scattered like fallen soldiers, a mosaic of broken bread and smeared fruit. The sound of the crash echoed in the silent kitchen, a final definitive punctuation to her tantrum. She had not just insulted his food. She had literally thrown it to the ground. The humiliation was now tangible, lying there in a messy heap for all to see. She was making a point. His work, his effort, was garbage to be trampled underfoot. A young waitress named Clara stood nearest to the disaster. Her knuckles were white where she gripped a water pitcher. A hot surge of anger, fierce and protective, rose in her throat. This was wrong. It was more than wrong, it was cruel. She saw the quiet dignity of the chef, the way he stood there taking this abuse without a word, and it broke her heart. She wanted to scream at this horrible bride, to tell her what a monster she was being. But she was just a waitress. Her job was on the line. Fear warred with her conscience, and for now, fear won. She bit her lip and said nothing, her silence feeling like a betrayal. Daniel, who had been frozen in the doorway, finally moved. "Amber, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. He took a step towards her, his face a mask of disbelief. He couldn't process what he was seeing. This wasn't the woman he had just married. This was a stranger, a petty tyrant, delighting in her own cruelty. But Amber was already turning away, her performance complete. She shot a final triumphant glare at Marcus, then swept out of the kitchen as dramatically as she had entered. She didn't even glance at her new husband. She left him standing in the wreckage of her fury, a silent witness to her monstrous behavior. The moment she was gone, the spell was broken. The kitchen staff began to move again, but the energy was different. The earlier professionalism was replaced by a tense, resentful quiet. Someone knelt to start cleaning up the mess on the floor. Whispers immediately began to circulate among the guests in the ballroom. Those seated near the kitchen doors had heard the shouting, the crash. "Did you hear that?" one woman murmured to her husband. "Sounded like the bride." A man at another table shook his head. "I saw her go in there." She looked furious. The perfect, happy atmosphere had been poisoned. The humiliation wasn't just contained to the kitchen anymore. It was seeping out, a dark stain spreading across the white linen of the perfect wedding. And in the center of it all, Marcus Reed stood, his calm expression unchanged, as if he were merely observing a play. But deep within his quiet eyes, a decision was being made. A storm was gathering. Marcus Reed was not a man defined by a simple white apron. To see him now standing stoically amidst the quiet chaos of the kitchen, one would never guess the true scope of his world. The apron was a disguise, a uniform of humility he wore by choice. In reality, that apron concealed a titan. Marcus Reed was the owner and visionary behind a culinary empire, a collection of 5 of the most celebrated restaurants on the planet. Each one bore the coveted Michelin stars. 2 had 2 stars, and 3 held the ultimate prize of 3 stars. His name was spoken with reverence in the world's most exclusive kitchens. His recipes were deconstructed and studied in culinary schools from Paris to Tokyo. He was not just a cook. He was a millionaire many times over, an artist, a businessman, a force of nature who had reshaped modern cuisine. The story of how he came to be standing in this particular kitchen, on this particular day, was a story of debt and honor. It began over a decade ago, on a cold, rain-slicked night on a college campus. Daniel Collins, then a fearless, quick-thinking pre-med student, had been walking home from the library when he heard the screech of tires and a sickening crunch. A car had jumped the curb, pinning an older man against a brick wall. Without a moment's hesitation, Daniel had rushed to help. He used his belt as a tourniquet to stop the bleeding from a severe leg injury, and kept the man conscious and calm until paramedics arrived. The doctor later said that Daniel's swift actions had undoubtedly saved the man's life. That man was Marcus Reed's father. Marcus had never forgotten it. His family owed Daniel a debt that money could never repay. When Marcus, already a rising star in the culinary world, heard that Daniel was getting married, he reached out. He wanted to give him a wedding gift, something personal and meaningful. He offered to personally oversee and cook the entire wedding feast. It was a gift of staggering value, an experience that billionaires would pay a fortune for. Daniel, a kind and humble man, was overwhelmed and deeply grateful. He knew Marcus was a successful chef, but he had no idea of the true scale of his friend's fame. He just knew his friend was doing him an incredible honor. That was why Marcus was here. He hadn't sent his executive chef or a team from one of his restaurants. He had come himself. He had come undercover deliberately. He wanted the focus to be on the food, on the gift, on his friend's happiness. He didn't want the spectacle of his celebrity to overshadow the day. He had arrived with a small, trusted team who knew to keep his identity a secret. He had put on the plainest of aprons and immersed himself in the work, the pure, honest craft of cooking. For him, this was a return to his roots, a labor of love. It was an act of profound loyalty to the man who had saved his father. So when Amber Collins had stormed into his kitchen, her face contorted with petty rage, she wasn't just insulting a chef. She was spitting on a priceless gift. She was desecrating an act of honor. She, in her blind arrogance, had no clue about the man standing before her. She saw a servant. She couldn't see the king who had willingly donned a servant's clothes for the day. The audience, now armed with this secret, could feel the tectonic plates of the story shifting. The power dynamic they had witnessed was a complete illusion. Amber thought she held all the cards, but she was playing checkers against a grandmaster of chess. The humiliation she had inflicted was a lit match. and she had just tossed it into a room filled with dynamite. A storm was coming, an inevitable and perfectly orchestrated reckoning, and now everyone knew it but her. As one of his young assistants carefully swept up the last remnants of the shattered plate and scattered hors d'oeuvres, Marcus Reed retreated into the quiet landscape of his own mind. He had faced insults before. It was an unfortunate but predictable part of his journey. In the rarefied air of haute cuisine, an industry long dominated by European chefs with centuries of tradition behind them, a black man from Atlanta was an anomaly. Early in his career, he had encountered the sneers, the backhanded compliments, the proprietary arrogance of those who believed he didn't belong. He'd been told his flavors were too bold, his techniques unrefined. He'd been mistaken for a delivery driver at his own restaurants more times than he could count. Those early experiences had forged in him a core of tempered steel. He learned that reacting with anger was a fool's game. Anger was what they expected. It was what they wanted. It would confirm their prejudices, proving he was emotional, unprofessional, undeserving. So he developed a different strategy. He let their insults hang in the air, unanswered. He met their scorn with unnerving calm. And then he let his work speak for him. His food became his voice, his rebuttal, his ultimate vindication. A perfectly balanced sauce was more eloquent than any angry retort. A dish that could bring a critic to tears was a more powerful statement than any shouted defense. His actions, his success, his Michelin stars, those were his answers. They spoke a language everyone, even the arrogant, had to understand. His motive for being here today was simple and pure: loyalty. His promise to Daniel was sacred. He had vowed to create a perfect culinary experience for his friend's wedding, a celebration of love rendered in flavor and texture. He would not let Amber's tantrum derail that promise. Her behavior was a distraction, a brief, ugly storm cloud in an otherwise clear sky. He would see his mission through. He would serve the meal he had designed, and he would do it with the same precision and passion he would for the world's most discerning palates. That was his duty to his friend. But as he stood there watching his team reset, a different feeling began to smolder beneath his calm exterior. Amber's insult had been different. It wasn't the subtle, coded prejudice he was used to. It was raw, public, and deeply personal. "This food smells like trash. Did some janitor cook this?" She hadn't just attacked his professionalism. She had attacked his very essence, his humanity. She had tried to strip him of his dignity in front of his staff, in front of the people he was leading. That, he decided, had crossed a line. His loyalty to Daniel demanded he complete the meal, but his own self-respect demanded that this act of supreme arrogance not go unanswered. He would not stoop to her level. He would not cause a scene or ruin the reception. But he would ensure that by the end of the night the lesson would be taught and the truth would be served. And like his food, it would be served impeccably. Clara, the waitress, moved through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, but her mind was racing. The image of the bride slapping the tray to the floor was burned into her memory. The sound of the crash still echoed in her ears. It was the injustice of it all that she couldn't shake. The chef, this calm, focused man who treated every member of the staff with a quiet respect she'd rarely seen, had done nothing to deserve such a vicious attack. He had simply been doing his job and doing it brilliantly. She watched him now as he calmly gave instructions to the other chefs, his voice never rising, his demeanor radiating a control that seemed almost superhuman. She knew she had to say something. She couldn't just let it go. Waiting for a moment when he was alone, checking a pot of simmering sauce, she approached him cautiously. Her heart was pounding in her chest. "Chef?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus turned, his eyes meeting hers. They were kind eyes, she noticed, but they held a deep intelligence, a sense of seeing things others missed. "That wasn't right," Clara said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What she did, what she said, it was horrible. I just wanted you to know that we all saw it. We know it's not true. A flicker of something, gratitude perhaps, warmed his expression. Thank you, Clara. That means a great deal. Emboldened, she pressed on. If you need someone to say something, to the groom or to the wedding planner, I will. I'll tell them exactly what happened. She felt a surge of courage. For a moment she forgot about her job, about the risk. She just knew that standing up for this man was the right thing to do. Then she lowered her voice even more, leaning in slightly. I have it, she whispered. Marcus raised an eyebrow, questioning. When she started yelling, I don't know why, but I pulled out my phone. I recorded it. Her voice, anyway. I got everything she said about the food smelling like trash and you being a janitor. She pulled the phone slightly out of her apron pocket to show him before tucking it away again, a hidden piece of irrefutable evidence. Marcus looked at her, truly looked at her, and a slow, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. He was impressed by her quick thinking, by her innate sense of justice. He felt a deep sense of appreciation for this young woman's courage. He knew how risky that was for her, how easily she could be fired for such an act. You are a woman of integrity, Clara, he said, his voice soft but firm. He appreciated her offer, but he had his own plan, a more subtle and far more effective one. He placed a reassuring hand briefly on her shoulder. Hold on to that, but don't do anything just yet. Trust me. He looked towards the swinging doors that led to the ballroom. The truth always serves itself, just like food. You just have to be patient and wait for the right course. Clara nodded, understanding. She felt a sense of relief, a feeling that she had passed the responsibility to someone far more capable of handling it. She trusted him. There was something about his unshakable calm that inspired absolute confidence. As she walked away to grab a tray of water glasses, she felt a thrill of anticipation. The bride had started a war she couldn't possibly win, and Clara had just handed the general a secret weapon. The night was far from over. Daniel Collins found a small, deserted stone balcony off a side hallway, needing a moment to escape the forced smiles and cheerful chatter of his own wedding reception. The cool night air was a welcome shock to his system, but it did little to quell the fire of anger and shame burning in his gut. He gripped the cold stone railing, his knuckles turning white, and stared out into the darkness of the manicured gardens. He replayed the scene in the kitchen over and over in his mind. Amber's face twisted with a sneer he had never seen before. Her voice, sharp and cruel, echoing in the silent room. The sound of the silver tray crashing to the floor. And Marcus standing there, taking it all with that unnerving, saint-like patience. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. This wasn't just any chef. This was Marcus Reed. Daniel knew Marcus was a big deal, a successful restaurateur. But more than that, he was the son of the man Daniel had saved. Marcus was here as a friend, as a gesture of profound gratitude. He was bestowing upon them a gift of incredible talent and generosity, and Amber had spat on it. She hadn't just been rude to a member of the staff. She had insulted a guest of honor, a man to whom his family owed an immeasurable debt of gratitude. He felt a wave of profound embarrassment wash over him. What must Marcus think of him, of his family, of his choice in a wife? He had brought this woman into his life, and she had revealed a core of cruelty he had never allowed himself to see. He felt torn. This was his wedding day. Amber was his wife now. His instinct was to protect her, to smooth things over. But his conscience, his deep-seated respect for Marcus and his sense of right and wrong screamed at him. He couldn't protect this. He couldn't defend it. He thought back to all the little moments, the red flags he had ignored. Amber's obsession with appearances, her cutting remarks about service workers, her belief that money and status gave her the right to treat people however she pleased. He had always dismissed it as stress or a bad mood. But now, seeing it laid bare in such a raw and public way, he understood. This wasn't an exception. This was who she was. A decision began to form in his mind, solidifying from the turbulent chaos of his emotions. He would not confront her now. He would not turn his wedding reception into a battlefield. That would be a victory for her, a confirmation that her drama could command the center stage. Number. He would let the evening play out. He trusted Marcus. He had seen the look in Marcus's eyes, not of defeat, but of quiet calculation. Marcus had a plan. Daniel resolved to be a part of it. He would wait for the right moment, the perfect moment. And when that moment came, he would not be silent. He would make sure the truth was known. He took one last deep breath of the cold night air, his silent anger now channeled into a cold, clear resolve. He turned and walked back towards the ballroom, his face a mask of calm, ready to play his part in the drama that was about to unfold. Amber returned to the head table, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of victory. She felt powerful, vindicated. She had seen a flaw in her perfect day and had corrected it with swift and decisive action. She leaned over to her maid of honor, a woman named Jessica, and whispered conspiratorially, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "Can you believe that wannabe chef?" she said, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "He had the nerve to just stand there while the kitchen smelled like a garbage dump. I had to put him in his place." Jessica offered a weak, tight-lipped smile. She had seen the look on Amber's face when she'd stormed off. "Are you sure it was that bad, Amber?" "Everything smells amazing out here." Amber waved a dismissive hand, the large diamond on her finger catching the light. "Please, you have to be firm with people like that, or they'll walk all over you. My wedding deserves class, not some greasy spoon cafeteria food." I told him off, and I made sure his staff saw it. "They'll think twice before messing up again." She let out a short, triumphant laugh, convinced of her own righteousness. Her other bridesmaids, seated nearby, exchanged uneasy glances. They laughed along with her, but the sound was hollow, forced. They had known Amber for years. They were familiar with her demanding nature, her flair for the dramatic. But this felt different. There was a meanness to it, a lack of grace that was unsettling, especially on a day that was supposed to be about love and joy. They saw the whispers rippling through the nearby tables, the curious and judgmental glances being thrown their way. Amber, in her bubble of arrogance, was oblivious to it all. She believed she was the hero of her own story, the discerning bride who demanded perfection. She saw the frozen smiles of the waitstaff as fear and respect. She saw the shocked silence of the kitchen as an admission of their incompetence. She had no idea that what she perceived as her triumph was actually the beginning of her social downfall. Guests across the ballroom were noticing. Her blatant arrogance was a crack in the perfect facade of the wedding. An uncle of Daniel's leaned over to his wife. "She's got a mean streak, that one," he murmured. A college friend of the groom shook his head slightly. "Daniel's a good guy." I don't know what he sees in her. Amber's overconfidence grew with every passing moment. She felt untouchable. She was the bride, the center of the universe. Everyone was here to celebrate her, to serve her, to admire her. The world revolved around her today, and she had just reminded a lowly cook of his place in it. She lifted her glass in a silent toast to herself, a smug smile playing on her lips. She had won the battle, and she was certain she had already won the war. She couldn't have been more wrong. The incident in the kitchen did not stay in the kitchen. Like a drop of ink in a glass of water, the story began to spread, clouding the festive atmosphere of the ballroom. It started with the waitstaff. Their faces, usually professionally neutral, were now tight with suppressed anger and shock. They moved between the tables, refilling water glasses and clearing plates. But their movements were stiff, their smiles strained. Guests picked up on the change in mood immediately. The whispers started small. "Something's wrong with the staff," a woman commented to her companion. "They look terrified." Those who had been close enough to hear the commotion near the kitchen doors began sharing what they had witnessed. "I heard the bride screaming," one man said. "Something about the food." The story mutated as it traveled, as rumors always do, but the core elements remained the same. Amber had been cruel, a chef had been humiliated, and the perfect wedding now had an ugly secret. Clara, the young waitress with the recording on her phone, became an unwitting but crucial part of this growing network of information. As she served drinks, a few guests, older and kinder-looking people who seemed to be friends of Daniel's family, would ask her quietly, "Is everything all right in the kitchen, dear? We heard some shouting." At first, Clara was hesitant. She remembered the chef's words, "Be patient." But she also saw an opportunity. She didn't need to tell the whole story, just a piece of it. She leaned in conspiratorially. "The bride was unhappy," she would say, her voice low. "It's a shame, because the chef is someone very, very special." When they pressed for more details, she would just shake her head and give a mysterious smile. "You'll see. The meal will speak for itself. He's a true artist." Her words were like planting seeds of doubt and curiosity. The guests she spoke to looked over at the head table, at Amber, who was laughing loudly, and then they would look towards the kitchen doors, a new sense of anticipation in their eyes. They didn't fully believe her. How could an ordinary-looking wedding chef be that special? But the idea was planted. It added another layer of tension to the simmering pot of the evening. Some guests felt embarrassed for Daniel, stuck with a bride who behaved so poorly. Others were simply disgusted by Amber's public display of cruelty. The room was no longer united in celebration. It was now divided into factions, those who were oblivious, those who were on Amber's side, and a growing number who were waiting with a strange sense of anticipation to see what would happen next. The air was thick, not just with the scent of fine food, but with the undeniable feeling that the main event of the evening had not yet begun. Marcus stepped out of the kitchen's back door into a small utilitarian alleyway. The heat and noise of the kitchen faded behind him, replaced by the cool, quiet hum of the evening. The air smelled of damp pavement and distant flowers from the estate's gardens. He needed this moment of stillness, not to calm his nerves, they were already steady as stone, but to execute the next phase of his plan. He pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket, a sleek, modern device that looked out of place with his simple apron. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name for only a second before he pressed it. The phone rang only once before it was answered. The voice on the other end was sharp, efficient, and instantly recognizable. It was Julian, his public relations director, a man who could orchestrate a media frenzy or quell a corporate crisis with equal unflappable skill. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice holding a note of surprise. "I didn't expect to hear from you. Everything all right with the Collins wedding?" Julian knew, of course, where he was. He had tried to talk Marcus out of going undercover, calling it an unnecessary risk. "Everything is proceeding as planned," Marcus replied, his voice calm and level. There was no hint of the drama that had just unfolded. He was all business. "Julian, I need you to do something for me. I need it done immediately. Anything, name it. I want you to call Jean-Pierre Dubois," Marcus said, naming the most notoriously difficult and influential food critic in the country. "And then I want you to call the board from the Vanguard Hospitality Group." This was the investment firm that had been trying to partner with him for over a year, a multi-billion-dollar deal that was hanging in the balance. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Julian was processing the bizarre request. "Tonight? Marcus, it's 8 o'clock on a Saturday. They're probably at dinner with their families." "I'm aware of the time," Marcus said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Tell them Marcus Reed has a last-minute invitation for them. Tell them I am unveiling a new concept tonight, a private tasting, and it is imperative they attend. Give them the address of the estate. Tell them to be here within the hour and to look for a table reserved under my name." Julian was silent for another moment, the gears in his sharp mind turning. He knew Marcus better than anyone. He knew this wasn't a whim. This was a calculated move. "Consider it done," he said, his voice now filled with a new energy. "The investors. The critics. Tonight. Is there anything else?" "That's all," Marcus said. "Thank you, Julian." He hung up the phone without another word. He stood there for a moment longer, the cool night air washing over him. He looked up at the star-dusted sky. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. The trap was set. The pieces were moving. Amber Collins had wanted to judge his food, to pass sentence on his work based on a smell and a simple apron. Very soon, she would find herself in a room full of the most powerful judges in the culinary and financial world. He had not started this fight, but he was about to end it. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his eyes calm and clear, and walked back into the kitchen to prepare the main course. The announcement came from the wedding planner, her voice amplified by the microphone, cheerful and oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats, dinner is about to be served." There was a gentle shuffle of chairs and a murmur of conversation as the 200 guests settled at their designated tables. The air in the grand ballroom was thick, not with excitement, but with a strange, palpable anticipation. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen. At the head table, Amber sat like a queen on her throne. She smoothed the skirt of her gown, a smug, self-satisfied smile on her lips. She believed the transition to dinner was a sign that she had won, that the kitchen staff had been properly chastened and were now scurrying to meet her high standards. She glanced at Daniel, who sat beside her silent and stone-faced. She mistook his silence for admiration of her authority. She felt powerful, in control. Then, the kitchen doors swung open. But it wasn't a procession of waiters that emerged. It was Marcus Reed himself. He carried 2 plates, one in each hand. He moved with a quiet, focused grace, his steps measured and deliberate. He walked directly to the head table, all eyes in the room following him. He placed one plate in front of Daniel and the other in front of Amber. He did it without a word, his expression unreadable. He then turned and went back to the kitchen, emerging again and again, serving each member of the bridal party himself before his team of waiters began to serve the rest of the room. It was an act of incredible humility and service, yet it felt like a display of absolute power. He was an artist, personally unveiling his masterpiece. As Marcus worked, a quiet ripple of movement occurred at the back of the ballroom. Several small groups of people, dressed in expensive, impeccably tailored business attire, slipped into the room. They were guided by a discreet member of the estate staff to a series of tables that had been reserved but remained empty until now. They were quiet, professional, their faces serious. Among them was the unmistakable figure of Jean-Pierre Dubois, the critic, his sharp, bird-like features scanning the room with a practiced, judgmental eye. Another table was filled with the stern-faced men and women of the Vanguard Hospitality Group, the investors Marcus had summoned. They blended in as best they could, but their aura of wealth and power was impossible to hide completely. They looked confused, intrigued, but when they saw Marcus Reed himself, in an apron, serving plates, their confusion turned to stunned silence. The table was set. The players were all in place. The performance was about to begin. A hush fell over the ballroom as guests looked down at the plates before them. It was a work of art. The main course was a pan-seared duck breast, its skin rendered to a perfect crispy mahogany. It was fanned out next to a creamy mound of truffle-infused risotto, each grain distinct and glistening. Delicate, vibrant green asparagus spears were laid across the plate, and a rich, dark cherry reduction sauce was drizzled around the edges in a perfect, glossy swirl. The aroma was intoxicating, 1,000 times more complex and beautiful than anything that could be smelled from the kitchen door. Slowly, tentatively, guests lifted their silver forks. A man at a table near the front took the first bite. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly, a look of utter disbelief spreading across his face. He put his fork down and simply stared at his plate, as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just tasted. His wife watched him, then took her own bite. A soft gasp escaped her lips. She brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining. This silent, stunned reaction rippled across the room, table by table. The low murmur of conversation died away completely, replaced by an awestruck silence, broken only by the soft clinking of cutlery and the occasional involuntary gasp of pleasure. People who had been whispering about the bride's tantrum were now speechless. The food was not just good, it was transcendent. It was a symphony of flavors, each note perfect, each texture a revelation. The crispy skin of the duck gave way to meat so tender and flavorful it melted on the tongue. The risotto was earthy and creamy, the asparagus crisp and fresh, the cherry sauce a perfect balance of sweet and tart. At the back of the room, Jean-Pierre Dubois, the formidable critic, took a bite. His notoriously stern expression softened. He closed his eyes, savoring the flavor. He took another bite, then another. He set his fork down, picked up his linen napkin, and gently wiped a single, genuine tear from the corner of his eye. The investors from the Vanguard group were watching him, and then they tasted the food themselves. They looked at each other, their sharp business minds momentarily silenced by pure sensory delight. This wasn't just a meal. It was a multi-million-dollar argument on a plate. At the head table, Amber had been watching the room's reaction with growing confusion. She picked at her own plate, her arrogance warring with her curiosity. Finally, she took a small, hesitant bite. Her face, which had been set in a smug mask, suddenly went blank. The flavors exploded in her mouth, a complex, undeniable wave of perfection. It was, without a doubt, the single best thing she had ever eaten in her entire life. "It's actually good," she muttered to herself, the words a disbelieving whisper. It didn't make sense. How could this be? How could the man she had just humiliated, the lowly cook in the dirty apron, have created something so perfect? Around her, the spell of silence was broken as guests, unable to contain their amazement, began pulling out their phones. They weren't texting. They were taking pictures of their plates, documenting the masterpiece, desperate to capture a piece of the magic they were experiencing. The room was no longer just a wedding reception. It had been transformed into a temple of culinary worship, and everyone was a stunned, humbled convert. The sound of a fork tapping gently against a crystal glass cut through the astonished buzz of the room. Every head turned towards the head table. Daniel Collins was standing up. His face was calm, but his eyes were fixed on his new wife with an intensity that made the air crackle. The smile was gone from Amber's face, replaced by a look of nervous confusion. "I'd like to say a few words," Daniel began, his voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone that had been placed on the table for speeches. The room fell completely silent, sensing that this was no ordinary toast. Daniel did not look out at his guests. He looked directly at Amber. "We're all enjoying this incredible meal," he said, his voice laced with an irony that was lost on no one. "A meal that some of us perhaps didn't think would be very good." Amber's cheeks began to flush a pale pink. She knew he was talking about her. "Amber," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more pointed. "You were very concerned about the quality of our wedding feast. You went into the kitchen to make your feelings known. But there's something you don't know. There's something most of you here tonight don't know." He paused, letting the suspense build. He turned his gaze from his wife and looked towards the kitchen doors, where Marcus was standing, watching silently. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Daniel asked, his voice rising again, filled with a righteous anger that he had kept bottled up all evening. "That man," he said, pointing now directly at Marcus. "The man you called a janitor. The man whose food you said smelled like trash. His name is Marcus Reed." A few gasps rippled through the back of the room from the tables where the critics and investors sat. Their suspicions were confirmed. Daniel continued, his words coming faster now, a torrent of truth. "He is the owner of 5 Michelin-starred restaurants. He's not just a chef. He's a culinary legend. He is a millionaire many times over. And he came here tonight, not because we paid him, but as a personal gift to me, as a favor, because I once did a small kindness for his family. He cooked for us as an act of honor. A massive, collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The truth landed like a physical blow. Jaws dropped. Guests looked from the humble man in the apron to the horrified bride, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with sickening clarity. Amber's face had turned from pink to a ghostly sheet white. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The full, crushing weight of her mistake, of her monumental arrogance, was crashing down upon her. And then, a new sound filled the room. It was faint at first, then grew louder as the wedding planner, on a subtle signal from Clara, turned up the canto, ballroom's main sound system. It was a voice, Amber's voice, sharp, cruel, and unmistakable. "This food smells like trash," the recording shrieked, echoing through the crystal chandeliers. "Did some janitor cook this?" Clara, standing by the soundboard, met Daniel's gaze from across the room and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The recording played on, every humiliating word broadcast for all 200 guests to hear. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a crushing, suffocating silence that pressed down on Amber, burying her in her own public shame. In the midst of the stunned silence, all eyes fell on Marcus Reed. He stood near the kitchen doors, a silent, powerful presence. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached behind his back and untied the strings of his simple white apron. He shrugged it off his shoulders, folding it neatly in one hand. The transformation was breathtaking. Underneath the plain apron, he was wearing an impeccably tailored, dark gray suit. The fabric was obviously expensive, the cut perfect. It was the armor of a man accustomed to boardrooms and command, not kitchens. He stood taller, his posture shifting from that of a humble artisan to that of a confident leader. The illusion of the lowly cook vanished in an instant. In his place stood Marcus Reed, the titan of the culinary world, a man whose quiet confidence filled the entire cavernous ballroom. He was no longer a victim. He was the master of ceremonies, the one who had been in control all along. As if on cue, the men and women at the back tables, the investors and the critics, pushed their chairs back and rose to their feet. Jean-Pierre Dubois, the critic who had been brought to tears by the food, began to applaud. His applause was slow, deliberate, and resonant. It was a sign of ultimate respect. The investors from the Vanguard group joined in, their applause sharp and enthusiastic. They weren't just applauding a meal. They were applauding the man, his genius, his character, and the brilliant unspoken power play they had just witnessed. The applause spread like a wildfire. Soon the entire room was on its feet, a standing ovation, not for the bride and groom, but for the chef. The sound was deafening, a roar of approval and admiration that washed over Marcus. He simply nodded his head, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, his eyes calm and dignified. Amber stumbled back in her chair, as if she had been physically struck. Her mind reeled, unable to process the rapid, catastrophic reversal of fortune. One moment she was the queen, triumphant and powerful. The next she was the villain, exposed and humiliated in front of everyone she knew. She looked from the applauding guests to Daniel, whose face was set like stone, and finally to Marcus, the man she had mocked, who was now being celebrated like a hero. Her world had not just cracked. It had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The power dynamic had not just flipped, it had been completely annihilated, and she was buried beneath the rubble. Amber's mind scrambled for a defense, a way to reclaim control. She forced a laugh, a high, brittle sound that shattered against the wall of applause. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" she cried out, her voice a desperate, shrill plea. "He was wearing an apron. It's just a silly mistake." But no one was listening. No one was laughing with her. The applause died down, replaced by a cold, judgmental silence. The room was done with her. Her excuses sounded hollow, pathetic. It wasn't about the apron. It was about the cruelty behind her words, the arrogance that had fueled her actions. Daniel turned to her, his expression not one of anger anymore, but of a deep, sorrowful disgust. The love and adoration he had felt for her just hours ago had been burned away, leaving only the ashes of disappointment. "It wasn't a mistake, Amber," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "It was your character. That's who you are. You didn't know who he was, so you thought you could treat him like he was nothing." He shook his head slowly, a look of finality in his eyes. "You disrespected a man who showed us more honor tonight than you have ever shown anyone. You tried to humiliate a man who is greater than you will ever be." His words were the final blow. Amber's carefully constructed facade of confidence and superiority crumbled into dust. Her face contorted, and a raw, ugly sob tore from her throat. The public humiliation, the utter rejection from her new husband, the condemning silence of her guests. It was too much to bear. She buried her face in her hands and broke down, her body shaking with convulsive, gut-wrenching sobs. Her bridesmaids, who had once been her loyal court, looked away, their faces a mixture of pity and embarrassment. No one moved to comfort her. She was utterly, completely alone in her self-made prison of shame. Amidst the wreckage of Amber's collapse, Marcus moved with purpose. He walked past the head table, not even glancing at the sobbing bride. He made his way to where Clara was standing near the edge of the room, looking overwhelmed but resolute. He stopped in front of her. "Clara," he said, his voice warm and kind, "your courage and integrity did not go unnoticed." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. "I am opening a new restaurant in the city next month. I need a floor manager who understands that respect is the most important thing we serve. The job is yours if you want it." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of shock and gratitude. She stared at the card, at the famous name embossed in gold foil, and then back at the man offering it to her. She could only nod, unable to speak. In one night, her courage to do the right thing had changed her life forever. As the guests began to murmur amongst themselves, processing the incredible drama they had witnessed, Marcus walked to the microphone at the head table. He picked it up, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention once more. The final act was his to direct. He raised a glass of water from the table, a simple cleansing gesture. "Tonight," he began, his voice calm and resonant, "was meant to be a celebration of a promise between friends. A celebration of love and a new future for Daniel." He paused and looked at his friend with warmth and solidarity. It also became a lesson. He scanned the faces of the guests, his gaze connecting with people all over the room. "In my world, in my kitchens, we search for the finest ingredients from all over the globe. We use complex techniques. But I have learned that all of that is meaningless without one core ingredient." He let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "Respect," he declared. "Respect for the craft. Respect for the people you serve. And most importantly, respect for the people who serve you, no matter what they are wearing or what job they do. Respect is the only ingredient that every single table needs." He raised his glass higher. "A toast to my friend Daniel. And to respect," the room erupted. "To respect," guests called out, raising their own glasses. The cheer was thunderous, a release of all the tension and a celebration of the powerful, simple truth Marcus had just delivered. The moral of the evening was clear, served hot and fresh for everyone to witness. Arrogance, in the end, only humiliates itself. But humility, dignity, and respect, those are the things that can feed nations and earn the applause of the world. The camera of the mind would fade out on the image of Amber, a solitary figure isolated by her own actions, weeping at a table laden with a feast she couldn't eat. The final shot would be of Marcus, surrounded by a crowd of new admirers and investors, shaking hands and smiling warmly. But his most important glance was reserved for his friend, Daniel, a look of shared understanding and enduring loyalty that said more than any words ever could. His honor was restored, his greatness was undeniable, and justice had been served. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.